Fall had just begun, and where I live, that means the weather turns cool and breezy, my favorite kind. There's something magical about those early autumn days, with the crisp air and the golden light filtering through the trees. It's the perfect time of year, and I look forward to it every year. Last October was no different. I remember it vividly, as if it happened yesterday. It was the first week of October, and Halloween was just around the corner. I've always loved decorating for Halloween, so one morning before work, I stopped by the store to pick up some decorations. I bought orange string lights, fake spider webs, and a few spooky lawn ornaments. I had big plans to set everything up that evening as soon as I got home. I wanted the house to have that eerie glow when night fell. But, as it usually happens, life had other plans for me. That day at work, one of my coworkers called in sick, and I had to cover for them. I ended up staying late and didn't get home until 7 p.m., much later than I'd planned. The sun had already set, and it was getting dark. Still, I was determined to put up the decorations, even if it was late. I love Halloween, and the excitement of getting the house ready for trick-or-treaters gave me the energy to keep going. When I got home, I grabbed the bags of decorations and headed outside. It was dark, but with my outdoor lights on, it wasn't too bad. The cool night air felt refreshing after a long day, and I started with the orange lights, carefully weaving them through the bushes in front of my house. As I worked, I heard footsteps approaching from the side of the house. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a neighbor or someone out for a walk. But when I glanced up, I saw a man coming around the side of my house. He didn't say a word, just walked right up, startling me. He hadn't made any noise until he was almost right next to me, which was strange. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and having a stranger appear out of nowhere like that made me uneasy. "Hey, you're on my property. Can you leave?" I said, my voice firmer than I felt. The man stopped and looked at me. He was in his 40s, with short brown hair and a blank expression on his face. He didn't seem angry, just off. His clothes were dirty, and the way he moved, slow and aimless, made me wonder if he was homeless. He didn't seem to care that I had confronted him. After a moment of staring at me, he simply said, "Sure thing," and turned around, walking down toward the road. I watched him for a moment, uneasy, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was just passing by, lost, or confused. People like that are harmless most of the time, I reasoned. I went back to setting up the lights, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every now and then, I glanced up, and sure enough, the man was still there. He hadn't really left. He stood across the street, pacing back and forth. Sometimes, he'd stop and look over at me. Each time I caught him staring, my skin crawled. I tried to ignore him, focusing on finishing the lights. Once I was done, I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing with thoughts about the man, but I tried to brush it off. He was probably just some wanderer with nowhere to go. I convinced myself he wasn't a threat. I made dinner, trying to distract myself, and then went upstairs to my bedroom to relax and watch some TV. The house was quiet, and I started to feel more at ease. But just as I was settling into bed, I heard something from downstairs. At first, it was faint, like something sliding across the floor. I paused the TV and listened more closely, but the noise stopped. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it. Houses make weird noises all the time, pipes, winds, creaks. But after seeing that man outside, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. My gut told me something wasn't right. I got up and slowly made my way downstairs. The first thing I noticed was that all the lights were off. That was strange because I was certain I had left them on. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt my heart start to race. I flicked on the hallway light and stood still, listening. The house was silent now, but I felt something in eerie stillness that wasn't there before. As I moved toward the back of the house, I noticed the sliding glass door was wide open. My stomach dropped. That sound I had heard earlier? It was the door sliding open. I hadn't left it unlocked, let alone wide open. Someone had opened it. Panic surged through me. My mind raced with questions. Was someone inside? Should I run or grab my phone? I didn't know what to do. The house felt wrong, like someone had been there, disturbing its quiet peace. "Hello? Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response. I walked toward the open door, peeking outside into the darkness. Nothing, no movement. But as I turned back toward the house, I saw something, or rather, someone. In the corner of the living room, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure standing completely still, watching me. I gasped, my heart racing. The moment I made that noise, the figure lunged at me. In the faint light, I saw him for just a second. It was the same man from earlier, the one who had been pacing across the street. He had been inside my house, hiding in the darkness, waiting. I ran. Without thinking, I bolted through the open door and into the backyard. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps pounding, getting closer. I sprinted toward the nearest house, my lungs burning, and started banging on the door, screaming for help. To my relief, the door opened quickly, and I rushed inside, breathless and terrified. I looked back, and there he was standing in the yard, staring at me with that same blank expression. He didn't move, just stood there watching as I frantically explained what had happened to the neighbors. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man had disappeared into the night. They found that the lock on my sliding door had been broken, probably earlier that day while I was at work. The man had been inside my house, waiting for the right moment to make his move. I don't like to think about what could have happened if I hadn't noticed him hiding in the dark. That night changed everything for me. I never look at those quiet, fall evenings the same way anymore. Story 2 by Anonymous. My family owns a sprawling piece of land deep in the woods, a place where towering trees stretch high into the sky and the sounds of nature fill the air. Nestled on the edge of this vast property is a cozy cabin. It feels a world away from the main house, with its wooden walls and rustic charm, surrounded by dense foliage that makes it seem almost hidden from view. This year, I decided to visit my parents and siblings at the end of October, a time when the air turns crisp and the leaves transform into brilliant shades of orange and red. As I drove up to the property, I felt a sense of nostalgia wash over me. It had been a while since we had all gathered together, and I was excited to reconnect. The main house was bustling with activity when I arrived. Laughter and chatter echoed around me as my family celebrated the rare occasion of being together. Since the house was already full, I volunteered to stay at the cabin for a few days, eager to embrace the peacefulness it offered. The cabin had always felt like my sanctuary. It was a place where I could unwind, away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. I loved the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the wooden floors. I imagined cozy nights spent reading or listening to the sounds of the forest outside, a comforting backdrop to my solitude. On the first day of my visit, I noticed that there was no drivable road leading directly to the cabin, so I parked my car at the main house. All I had was a light backpack with my essentials, some clothes, toiletries, and a few snacks. I wasn't planning on spending much time there, just sleeping, so I figured I could leave my bag at the cabin later. Around 5 p.m., We gathered for what felt like a small family reunion. It had been so long since we were all together, and the atmosphere was lively with food, drinks, and shared stories. We reminisced about our childhood, laughed over old memories, and caught up on what had happened since our last get-together. I felt grateful to be surrounded by my family, but as the evening wore on, I could feel my energy dwindling. After a couple of hours, I decided to excuse myself. "I think I'm going to head to the cabin and get ready for bed," I announced. Everyone nodded, some still absorbed in their conversations, while others raised their glasses in a cheerful toast. I shouldered my backpack, feeling the familiar weight of it against my back, and slipped out the back door into the cool evening air. The trail to the cabin was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick trees and underbrush. It usually took about 10 minutes to walk, but as the sun began to set, the shadows grew longer, and the air felt heavy with an eerie stillness. I hadn't really thought about how dark it would be, and I quickly realized there were no lights along the path. Pulling out my phone, I turned on the flashlight feature, hoping it would guide my way. As I walked, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease creeping in. It was just a regular walk in the woods, I told myself. But then, as I stepped carefully over the uneven ground, I heard a stick snap behind me. My heart raced, and I turned around, shining my phone's light toward the sound. But the beam barely cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and shadows. "Probably just a squirrel or something," I murmured to myself, shaking my head. I tried to brush it off and continued down the trail, but a knot of tension formed in my stomach. A few moments later, I heard it again, a loud snap, like someone stepping on a branch. It felt like as soon as I started walking, something else was walking behind me, following my every step. "Who's out there, Alex? I know it's you." "Not funny, bro," I called out, hoping it was just my brother trying to scare me. If it really was him, he would be laughing by now, right? But deep down, I knew something felt off. The darkness around me was suffocating, and I began to walk faster, my heart pounding in my chest. As I hurried along the trail, I could hear the crunching of leaves and twigs behind me. I resisted the urge to look back, knowing I wouldn't see anything reassuring. The thought that my mind might be playing tricks on me crossed my mind. Maybe I had drunk a bit too much at dinner. Whatever it was, I didn't want to be out in the woods any longer, so I pushed myself to move faster. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the cabin. I hurriedly unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me, taking a moment to catch my breath. The familiar smell of wood and the cozy interior greeted me, providing a sense of relief. I tossed my backpack onto the floor and rubbed my face, trying to wipe away the stress from my earlier experience. But just as I thought I was safe, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Someone was turning the doorknob, trying to get in. Panic surged through me. When they realized the door was locked, they began banging on it hard. This wasn't just a knock, it felt like someone was trying to break it down. I nearly fell over from the shock, my heart racing uncontrollably. They kept pounding on the door, and I felt frozen in place. What should I do? I crept toward the thin window beside the door, heart pounding in my chest. I needed to see who it was. I peered through the glass, and there he was, a man in a dark jacket and heavy boots, someone I had never seen before in my life. My breath caught in my throat as our eyes locked for a brief moment. His gaze was filled with rage, and before I could process what was happening, he started pounding on the window too. Just then, I heard a loud voice yell from the woods, startling both of us. The man paused, looked toward the sound, and then sprinted away into the darkness, disappearing among the trees. My mind was racing. Who was that man? What did he want? About 30 seconds later, I saw my brother Alex running up to the cabin, panic etched on his face. He must have seen the guy following me as I walked to the cabin. After asking our parents if they knew him, he came racing to find me, concern driving him forward. "Are you okay?" he asked, out of breath. I nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. I told him everything: the snapping branches, the feeling of being followed, and the man at the door. To this day, we've never seen that man again, and we still have no idea what he was doing on our property or why he was stalking me that night. The memory sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. It was a terrifying reminder of how quickly things can change in the woods, turning a peaceful night into a nightmare. Even now, as I reflect on that night, I can't shake the feeling of unease that lingers. The woods are beautiful, but they hold secrets, and sometimes those secrets are best left undiscovered. Story 3 by Nathaniel O. Fall had finally arrived, and to me, that meant one thing: camping season. As the leaves transformed into vibrant shades of yellow and orange, the crisp air filled with a slight breeze made it impossible to resist the call of the outdoors. Each year, I looked forward to this time, when the forest seemed to come alive with color. The sound of crunching leaves underfoot and the sight of trees dressed in fall foliage felt magical. I often wondered why more people didn't embrace the beauty of nature during the fall. Perhaps they were caught up in their busy lives or just didn't realize how wonderful it was to be outside at this time of year. But I wasn't complaining. Having the trails to myself felt like a little slice of paradise. This year, I chose to revisit a familiar trail that led to a campsite I loved. It was always empty, nestled deep within the forest, surrounded by tall trees that whispered secrets in the wind. Normally, it wasn't anything special, just a quiet spot to pitch my tent. However, with the brilliant fall colors painting the landscape, it promised to be breathtaking. After arriving at the campsite, I unloaded my gear and immediately set out to gather some dry sticks for my campfire. The sun was still high in the sky, around 4 p.m., giving me a good 3 hours of daylight before sunset. I wandered around the area, my eyes scanning the forest floor for the driest sticks I could find. Each crunch of leaves beneath my boots added to the comforting feeling of being in nature. Then, suddenly, I looked up and froze. My heart raced as I spotted a man standing among the trees about 30 feet away from me. He was just watching, his gaze cold and lifeless. I felt a chill run down my spine as I took in his tall frame, clad in a flannel coat and jeans. There was something unsettling about the way he stood there, staring at me without blinking. Desperate to break the tension, I waved at him. To my surprise, he simply backed away slowly, disappearing into the trees. My heart sank. Where was he going? The forest felt suddenly larger and more intimidating. I shook off the unease and convinced myself he was just another camper exploring the area. But as I gathered sticks, the unsettling feeling lingered. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see him reappear. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, making it even harder to hear any sounds around me. I tried to focus on my campfire preparations, but the unease wrapped around me like a thick fog. When the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest, I finally managed to light my campfire. Its warm glow flickered in the growing darkness, creating a cozy atmosphere. I hoped for a peaceful evening under the stars, but as the darkness enveloped me, an unsettling feeling crept back in. The fire crackled, but the surrounding woods felt ominous. I couldn't shake the memory of the man. What was he doing out here? Was he really just another camper? I reassured myself that he had probably moved on, but I kept glancing into the shadows. The leaves rustled around me, and I could have sworn I saw a shadow flit just beyond the reach of my firelight. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped more than I anticipated. I decided to retreat into my tent, hoping that being inside would provide some comfort. I bundled up in my sleeping bag, trying to push away the nagging sense of dread that had settled in my stomach. The fire slowly fizzled out, leaving me in darkness, but I eventually managed to drift off to sleep. However, I don't think I slept for long. I was jolted awake, my eyes snapping open as if someone had flipped a switch. I lay still, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to figure out if I had actually heard something or if it was just my imagination. The only sounds I could discern were the leaves gently brushing against the side of my tent and the soft sway of the trees around me. Then, out of nowhere, I caught a different sound, the distinct crunch of leaves, one after another. Someone was walking around outside my tent. My heart dropped. Panic surged through me as I realized how vulnerable I was, trapped in this flimsy fabric with no idea what was going on outside. My mind raced with terrifying thoughts. What if it was the man from earlier? In a moment of sheer instinct, I grabbed my bag, unzipped the tent, and burst outside. That's when I came face to face with him again. He stood there, not even 5 feet away from the entrance, his dead stare locking onto mine. I felt like I was staring into an empty void. The most unsettling part was how he didn't move or flinch. He just stood there, watching me. Fear consumed me, and I didn't think twice. I turned and ran into the woods, not caring where I was headed, just needing to get as far away from him as possible. The darkness swallowed me, the wind howled in my ears, and the leaves crunched beneath my feet. I had no idea if he was chasing me or not. All I could focus on was the adrenaline pumping through my veins. In the chaos, luck was on my side. I stumbled upon a section of the trail I recognized. Even in the dark, relief washed over me as I followed it back to the road, the lights from the highway twinkling in the distance like a beacon of safety. I never looked back. I didn't stop until I reached my car, the feeling of safety flooding back as I locked the doors behind me. That experience left me shaken. I never returned to that campsite. The thought of that man lurking in the shadows haunted me. Maybe I was overreacting, but deep down, I felt like that man had bad intentions. It was just a gut feeling, but it was enough to keep me away from those woods forever. Camping is supposed to be a joyful escape into nature, but that night transformed my love for the outdoors into a mix of fear and caution. I learned that sometimes the woods can hold secrets darker than the night itself.